increasing climate variability is making some parts of the world more susceptible to climate-related disasters, and we have proof of that. Factors such as poverty and conflict are making populations more vulnerable to the effects of climate-related disasters. So even if it is too early to say for certain that man-made climate change is causing an increase in humanitarian emergencies, one thing is certain. If it continues, it most certainly will. Climate change will lead to more frequent severe weather, causing more droughts and floods. It will exacerbate existing threats to human security and will create new ones. Climate change is certain to aggravate the causes of conflict, such as access to water, for example. And the combination of water stress and ethnic tensions that already exist in so many of our regions where we work, coupled with climate change, are really a recipe for humanitarian disaster. So all of these factors have profound implications for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. But the questions posed by this particular session, for me, do not really have an either-or answer. If asked whether our existing programs needed to be revamped or expanded, I would answer yes, of course, in both cases. An awareness of the implications of climate change needs to be built into practically everything we do now. So it's no good, for example, implementing programs on agriculture for the poor, water, health, migration, peace building, reconciliation, reconstruction, without taking into account the effect that climate change may have on these programs in the future. That is now a reality for us. And at the same time, the work that our organizations are already doing in the fields of disaster preparedness, disaster risk reduction and mitigation will require massive expansion, as Bekele said. We have already seen the value of this work in places such as Bangladesh, where we have constructed cyclone shelters that double up as schools and community centers. And they provide then a safe refuge when disaster strikes. And if you look at some of the statistics which prove the value of this, Cyclone Cedar in 2007 was one of the worst to hit Bangladesh in recent times. And although 3,000 people died, there were less severe storms which killed 45 times more in 1991 and 100 times more in 1972. So I think this graphically illustrates the need for such programs and the ratcheting up of such programs. Of course, from our perspective as Caritas, the effects of climate change will be felt the most by the world's poorest. People who live in the most vulnerable locations and lack the resources to protect themselves. Climate change certainly exacerbates existing vulnerabilities, and that is why it is vital for humanitarian organizations to relate climate change to the issue of poverty and to address the factors that make people vulnerable to climate change. But at the same time, I would say it is necessary that humanitarian organizations play a full role in the debate over addressing the causes of climate change. We cannot rely solely on politicians to provide an answer to climate change, because the solutions, of course, are going to hurt. The unpalatable truth is that there will be a price to be paid for a solution to climate change. And the price will have to be paid by the ordinary men and women of the developed world, who have benefited from the growth and development that is causing climate change. Like the global financial crisis, the climate change crisis can be seen in terms of excessive borrowing. We have borrowed from the atmosphere and biodiversity of the future. And now these loans will have to be repaid. This means quite simply that high consumers will have to accept a reduced standard of living. Now, of course, this does not mean they will be descending into poverty. But it may mean driving smaller cars, taking fewer holidays abroad, not eating exotic fruits and vegetables every day of the year, all year round, and maybe even paying just a little bit more tax. And I think there's actually nothing new in this suggestion. And I would quote to you from a statement made nearly 40 years ago by the Second Synod of Catholic Bishops. They stated, "Those who are already rich are bound to accept a less material way of life with less waste in order to avoid the destruction of the heritage which they are obliged by absolute justice to share with all other members of the human race." Now, for politicians, grasping the nettle is not going to be a vote winner. It is therefore incumbent on us as humanitarian players, humanitarian organizations, to focus on the ethical and moral dimensions of the climate change crisis. The scientific and economic arguments are, of course, important, but they are not enough. If we are to change the world, we have to change human behavior. And a fundamental change in human behavior cannot be based on short-term expediency. It can only be based on a deep-seated conviction that we have a moral duty to care for our fellow human beings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have one more panelist before we start opening up the whole debate. Two more people who need to speak. And then it's time for all of you, so I hope you are making notes and keeping track of what everyone else has said so far. Here is Mr. Saleh Saeed from the Islamic Relief Worldwide, IRW.
Thank you, Johan. Fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Islamic Relief is guided by Islamic principles, which encourages people to protect the earth and all life on it, and to maintain the balance in nature as created by God. We live, however, in a world of pollution, deforestation, climate change and desertification. And in this world, environmental concerns are often forgotten in favor of economic benefit. Yet the problems caused by the environmental degradation will not only affect future generations, they already threaten the world's population today. Poverty and environmental degradation are closely linked. The causes of environmental degradation disproportionately affect the poor, while poverty also accelerates environmental destruction. Poor communities often rely on agriculture, fisheries and natural resources in order to make a living, but the depletion of fertile grazing land, forests and water sources is leaving them with no way to feed or support themselves. This means they are forced into a cycle of ever-deepening poverty. In addition, global climate change and local environmental degradation have caused more natural disasters such as droughts, floods and storms. Those most vulnerable are the poorest communities who do not have the resources to protect themselves.